A model of scientific research in psychology. The learning objective for this section is review a general model of scientific research in psychology. This figure 2.1, I apologize, it's cut off a little bit. It'll be in full on the next slide. So this figure presents a simple model of scientific research in psychology. The researchers formulate a research question, conduct an empirical study designed to answer the question, analyze the resulting data, draw conclusions about the answer to the question, and publish the results so that they become part of the research literature, which is all the published research in that field. Because the research literature is one of the primary sources of new research questions, this process can be thought of as a cycle. New research leads to new questions, which leads to new research, which leads to new questions, and so on. This figure also indicates that research questions can originate outside of the cycle, either with informal observations or with practical problems that need to be solved. But even in these cases, the researcher would start by checking the research literature to see if the question had already been answered and to refine it based on what previous research had already found. The research by Mell and his colleagues is described nicely by this model. Their research question, whether women are more talkative than men, was suggested to them both by people's stereotypes and by claims published in the research literature about the relative talkativeness of women and men. When they checked the research literature, however, they found that this question had not been adequately addressed in scientific studies. They then conducted a careful empirical study, analyzed the results, finding very little difference between women and men, formed their conclusions, and published their work so that it became part of the research literature. The publication of their article is not the end of the story, however, because their work suggests many new questions, for example, about the reliability of the results or about potential cultural differences. These will likely be taken up by them and other researchers inspired by their work. As another example, there we go. Consider that as cell phones became more widespread during the 1990s, people began to wonder whether, and to what extent, cell phone use had a negative effect on driving. Many psychologists decided to tackle this question scientifically. It was clear from previously published research that engaging in a simple verbal task impairs performance on a perceptual or motor task carried out at the same time, but no one had studied the effect specifically of cell phone use on driving. Under carefully controlled conditions, these researchers compared people's driving performance while using a cell phone with their performance while not using a cell phone, and they did this both in the lab and on the road. They found that people's ability to detect road hazards, reaction time, and maintain control of the vehicle were all impaired by cell phone use. Each new study was published and became part of the growing research literature on this topic. For instance, other research teams subsequently demonstrated that cell phone conversations carry a greater risk than conversations with a passenger who's aware of driving conditions, which often become a point of conversation. So let's take a moment and watch a video on this. And if you want to see the video with the captions, it's available on YouTube by clicking here.
My name is David Strayer, and I'm a psychologist. I study cognitive neuroscience. That's the study of thinking, memory, perception, decision-making, and trying to understand how the brain is responsible for those behaviors. It's science in action. When I started working, I worked in telecommunications, just when cell phones were starting to become popular. And at that time, it was pretty clear that you could become sufficiently distracted by the use of cell phone technology when you're trying to drive a car. So I've been studying driver distraction, looking at what we understand about attention and how the brain can multitask, how that relates to our everyday behaviors driving an automobile. You can go ahead and start the car now. Why I love this job is I can basically ask any question I want about what makes us tick and how we behave, and use research methods and the scientific method to be able to answer those questions. That means observing, making hypotheses, designing experiments, and testing them. A lot of times people think if your eyes are on the road and your hands are on the wheel, you'll be fine. But if you use a cell phone, is that something that actually harms driving behavior? And how does it differ from other things like listening to a radio or talking to a passenger? We're interested in things like handheld and hands-free cell phones. How do those differ? We found that if you talk on a cell phone, you're 4 times more likely to be involved in a crash. That's the same crash risk as if you were driving at a 0.08 blood alcohol level if you're drunk. Worse is if you're texting. You're 8 times more likely to be involved in a crash. That's substantially worse than the drunk driver. We're looking now at some of the voice-based technologies.
Hello, Siri. Read appointments.
What we, I think, have learned is that some of these voice-based technologies are putting demands on the brain to try and multitask in ways that exceed the capacity to be able to do that activity and drive safely. We know that the research that's come out of my laboratory has been influential in changing regulatory policies and laws. At this point, 41 states in the United States now have laws that make it against the law to text while driving. There's a number of multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies that have taken the research that we've collected and have used that as a basis for policies for not using their cell phones while driving. They substantially reduced the total number of crashes for their employees, and there was no loss in productivity. At the end of the day, we would hope that you're going to see fewer fatalities on the roadway because people are not distracted. That's taking psychology and translating it directly into action. That's science in action.